Welcome to the Marc Steiner Show here on The Real News. I'm Marc Steiner, and it's great to have you all with us. You know, there's a critically important story unfolding. It can have a profound effect on the U.S. military and the safety of our drinking water and our health and policy. It's flying under the radar for most of us, unless you're living on Oahu or anywhere on the Hawaiian Islands. Hawaiians, and especially indigenous Hawaiians, have been protesting outside of a military base on the grounds of the state capitol because the military base on Red Hill on Oahu stores 200 million gallons of fuel oil buried just 100 feet above Oahu's biggest aquifer. It has made military families sick and threatens the health and well-being of people who get their drinking water from that aquifer. Now, let's take a step backwards. The struggle of the Hawaiian people has been going on for almost 125 years. Since the U.S. overthrew in 1898 the Hawaiian government at the behest of Dole Sugar so they can control plantations and seize power for their profit. Now, Hawaiian people have been fighting for their rights ever since, and their land ever since. And today, the United States military controls 22% of that island, answering to no one but themselves. Now, this particular battle, which also pits the Hawaiian state government against the political power and might of the U.S. military, is going to be precedent-setting and will have an effect on all people fighting for clean water, the right to the land, leading a healthy life, and not to be dominated. We are joined today by Mikey Inouye, who is an independent filmmaker, born and raised in Hawaii, community organizer, and member of Oahu Water Protectors. Let me just describe. Oahu Water Protectors are an organization that formed out of a coalition of Kānaka Maoli organizers, Sierra Club members and supporters, Hawaii Peace and Justice, and other groups working towards sovereignty, decolonization, and demilitarization. And Mikey, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Aloha. Thanks for having me, Mark. Good to be here.
It's good to have you. And so before we start, one thing I said in the beginning was that the coalition, the Oahu Waterkeepers, was a coalition of Kānaka Maoli organizers. So for those folks in our world who aren't familiar with Hawaiians or what that means, what does that mean?
Yeah, so Kanaka Maoli means, Native Hawaiian, essentially, native to this place, who have genealogical and ancestral ties to this place. It's what defines what it means to be indigenous to Hawaii. I myself am not Kānaka Maoli, but I am a descendant of Asian settlers who strives to be in solidarity with the struggle for Hawaiian sovereignty, to deoccupy Hawaii, to demilitarize Hawaii in the way that the United States has ever since they illegally overthrew the sovereign nation of Hawaii. And a lot of those efforts tie into the water because there is a very long history that is as long and longer than the occupation of the United States capitalist interests and militaristic interests, which are all one, to exploit, divert, and ultimately despoliate Hawaii's water in the same way that they have done to every country where they plant their bloody flag.
So I want to come back to what you just said about decolonization and what that means for you all and in this movement. But let's start with the battle at hand, the struggle at hand around Red Hill and the military base and what's happening with poisoning the aquifer. So give us a little bit of history. This is, as I said earlier, I think people are probably shocked to hear that 22% of the island is controlled by the military to start with. And so, yes. So let's start there and tell us what exactly this battle is about and what's going on.
Yeah, so it's interesting how people perceive Hawaii, particularly this kind of funhouse mirror version of it that's depicted through the tourism industry of like Waikiki, the very caricaturized version of Hawaiian culture. And this is explicitly marketed to tourists who are interested in having the militaristic experience as well. And part of that is concealing, but also reinterpreting what it is to be an occupying nation in the sovereign nation of Hawaii. And one a perfect characteristic example of this is the Pearl Harbor Memorial and the USS Arizona, which was sunk during the Japanese invasion. It is a ship that was sunk by the Japanese Empire when they bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and it is considered a tourist attraction, but it is also leaking over the years, ever since 1941, thousands of gallons of fuel, and patriots from all over the continental United States, they come there to contemplate how freedom is not free, and it kind of goes to show how U.S. presence requires this type of very dark propaganda that in order to justify their illegal presence here, they have to consecrate the obscene. And a lot of that type of indoctrination goes hand in hand with the long history of the United States military painting a very distorted picture of what's actually going on here. And they have been poisoning the waters, not just in Kapukaki, where the 20 Red Hill fuel tanks have sat ever since 1943 when they were completed and have leaked ever since, but also the waters of Pu'uloa, which many know to be Pearl Harbor. The reason that it was called Pearl Harbor to begin with is because it was so momono, it was so plentiful with oysters, pearl oysters, and fish. It was considered the breadbasket of the entire island. And now it is home to, at the very least, 6 Superfund sites. They actually had to narrow it down from several dozen contaminated sites in Pearl Harbor because there was just too many types of contamination going on because of the military presence there. So it is what was once one of the most plentiful, abundant, sustainable areas on the island is now one of the most contaminated sites on the planet. And so Red Hill is kind of just part of the long story of the US military contaminating the very islands that they have taken over and becomes stewards that they were never asked to be. And they have proven time and time again, not just with Red Hill, but with their entire presence in Hawaii, to be the worst stewards of land and water. They've proven this. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
That's right. No, I want to take us to Red Hill and what's going on, because for what I've seen in the videos that you helped produce, and what I've seen in the articles that I've been reading is that hundreds, and at least 100, maybe the thousands, I don't know, but from what I've seen visually, hundreds of people are protesting these fuel oil tanks that are right above the aquifer, that are leaking into the aquifer, that have made military families sick and made other people sick and threaten entire populations on the island itself. So, I mean, and it's so, and the military seems to be just giving the middle finger to everybody, saying, we don't have to deal with you. We don't have to talk to you. I don't care what you say. So what's going on in Red Hill at this moment?
Yeah, so there are a lot of organizations right now who are protesting and organizing around shutting down Red Hill. And that's just for starters. There are much longer term goals about expectations of what organizers and Kānaka Maoli advocates for their land and water are going to be asking for beyond just shutting down Red Hill. But that's a conversation for another time. This all began kind of in 2014 when the first catastrophic leak that we know of happened, which was 27,000 gallons of jet fuel into the soil and groundwater. And just for a little background about Red Hill itself, the Red Hill Bulk Fuel Storage Facility is 20 tanks that can hold up to 12.5 million gallons of fuel each. All of them are corroding. Yes, all of them are leaking. The full capacity for all of the tanks combined is about 250 million gallons, but that's actually not the current maximum capacity anymore, because around the top of each dome is so corroded that they can't even fill these tanks to the top anymore. But it's also corroding from the bottom as well. When they investigated the tank that leaked in 2014, there were multiple holes in the lining of these single-walled tanks that were built 80 years ago in World War II. And people have been protesting and advocating for the shutdown of Red Hill since then. And I mean, these tanks, the general public didn't even know about until the 90s when the information about their existence was declassified. And after the 2014 leaks, there was, a widespread public outcry, but the response from our elected representatives and corporate interests ended up winning the day. So we are faced with a problem that many people were warning about long before it reached this level of crisis, where thousands of people, many of them in military housing, many of them active duty service members, have been poisoned by the water that the Navy provided to them. The people who claim to be the ones who are protecting Hawaii from foreign invasion and terrorism and all threats, foreign and domestic, ended up poisoning the water that goes to 93,000 people on this island. And these tanks, they sit 100 feet above our sole source aquifer, the Moanalua Waimalu aquifer, that provides water to 450,000 people on this island at a minimum. And that water is still under threat because there is still at least 180 million gallons of fuel in those tanks right now that are supposed to be removed based on the governor's emergency order. They're supposed to have a plan in place by February 2nd to come up with a way to take the fuel down from that hill. The military, the U.S. Navy, is supposed to abide by this emergency order, which they were fighting right up until the point where it became politically unfeasible to do so. And they recently said to the House subcommittee on military readiness that they were complying, or that they planned to comply with this order, but they have been fighting health officials, the Sierra Club, the local government, the governor's office itself, the Department of Health, and the entire community on shutting down Red Hill and defueling the tanks. So they are agreeing to come up with a plan to defuel the tanks, but they are still planning to make Red Hill operational again in the near future. And that's what we're still currently fighting.
So a number of questions. Let me start with the lesson you said. How do you know that the military is planning to do more and bring more fuel to that site?
At the subcommittee hearing on readiness, the first to deal with the Red Hill crisis, the committee members themselves, but also Admiral Converse and other representatives in the Navy, have insinuated that they plan to get Red Hill back online, that they plan to remediate and repair Red Hill. But the thing is, those tanks, as engineering consultant Norfleet said in the contested case hearing for the Department of Health, contested case hearings, has stated that these tanks are in their end of life phase, that there is along a certain time horizon, there's a 100% chance that there will be a catastrophic failure. And a catastrophic failure will dwarf what we are going through right now. It would basically spell out the end of clean water and a way of life on Hawaii, or at least on Oahu as we know it. And they're willing, in the interest of national security, to take that risk despite any type of cost that the people and this Aina and Vai may receive. Because the costs are always external to the military.
So let's take where the struggle is now and where the battle is now. On the one hand, there have been these massive demonstrations, lions at the state capitol that I've seen, I think was in your documentary, people protesting outside the Red Hill military base, where Native Hawaiians are actually leading the kind of protests around them, making them very both political and very spiritual at the same time. Outside the base, you can describe that. But it also now involves, as you've been intimating, the state government, which is now battling the federal government of the United States and the U.S. military. So describe as briefly as you can what that struggle is, where it is, and what do you think is going to happen next?
Yeah, the site of the struggle is on multiple fronts, and one is legislative, but the other is in the streets, in communities, and Ka'ohevai, it's a coalition of exclusively Kānaka Maoli organizers and activists and Aloha Aina. They went in the front gate of U.S. Navy Command, Pacific Command, and they set up a ko'a which is constructed out of rocks. It's like an altar that is trying to, in times of need, like drought or famine, to collect resources to a location that needs it. And in this
That was in your
case,
documentary.
yes, what is needed is water. But also, as Dr. Kalihua Krug in the video described, it is also that is asking for solidarity, international solidarity, which is something that the islands are receiving, but not at the capacity that we need it to be. So that's part of the reason why it's great to have shows like this that are trying to put this into the national conversation and the international conversation, because not enough people are talking about it, because it's happening in paradise, right? It's happening on islands in the Pacific, and it's so remote to people. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's so abstract, and it's so geographically distant. But if this were happening anywhere else on the continental United States, it would be running front page news, almost every day. And here's the other thing, if literally anyone else was doing this besides the United States military, we wouldn't be talking about whether the US Navy would continue to have water permits or what their next steps would be. We would be discussing what types of crimes to charge them for in the International Criminal Court in The Hague.
So where we are now, it seems, from what I've seen in the articles I've been reading, this reached some intensity in just December, last month, in the protests that were taking place outside the base. It's continuing on in January, and it's continuing in January as well, with the Hawaiian government, especially in the state legislature, trying to stop the military from doing this. The military is playing games and they're dancing around it, and it could take years and years if it's just litigated for them to stop them, unless somehow politically you all, and in solidarity with other people around the country, can stop them from doing what they're doing. Is that about right?
That is precisely right. We need international solidarity, but we also need to build people power that comes with organizing community and taking collective action on this. And we are already kind of seeing the fruits of that labor. The reason that we were even able to get the Navy to where they are right now, where they're making these small concessions of doing the bare minimum of just claiming that they will be complying with the emergency order that the Secretary of the Navy, Carlos Del Toro, initially said was not an order, but a request, even though it was explicitly described by the governor and by the Department of Health as an emergency order. We were able, through community public pressure, to get them to that point. In other ways, we have put political pressure on the faux-gressives who represent us in the House and Senate.
What'd you call them?
The faux-gressives. Faux-gressives. Yeah, I mean, one particular example is Senator Brian Schatz, who calls himself a climate hawk, and who, out of his 19,000 something tweets on his personal Twitter, which has hundreds of thousands of followers, up until several weeks of public pressure that we put on him online, where he lives on Twitter, he finally typed in the words Red Hill for the first time out of all of his tweets. And one thing about people like Brian Schatz and Senator Mazie Hirono is that they have received over time hundreds of thousands of dollars in their campaign contributions from private defense contractors like Northrop Grumman, Base Systems, General Dynamics, you name it. If you can think of a private defense contractor, they have received a lot of donations from all of them, even so-called climate hawks. And, people like Schatz, who are on the Appropriations Committee, have appropriated hundreds of millions of dollars worth of funding projects that nobody but the military and the defense contractors wants. So
does that mean at the moment that the work you're doing and the protests taking place and the fact that people in the Hawaii state legislature especially are really pushing this hard politically, that it's kind of forcing them into a position where they have to stand up to it? I mean,
absolutely,
you're
100%.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, people like Hirono and Schatz and Ed Case, they make big noise about being concerned about this issue, but organizers in Sierra Club and Kānaka Maoli organizers have been begging them to act on this ever since the 2014 leaks and before. And they were summarily dismissed by these folks. Or, they were promised that decisive action would be done. And what we got instead were these mealy-mouthed statements and the expressed desire, which continues to this day from our elected representatives, to reform Red Hill, to repair Red Hill, when it is terminal. This is not a situation of something that can be repaired. This is something that you take offline. I've compared this, because even if they propose to double wall these tanks, they're still going to leak, and they will still be sitting 100 feet above our sole source aquifer that provides water to nearly 500,000 people on this island. There will still be a catastrophic leak. And so, it's much like trying to double mask a COVID patient who needs to be intubated. It's going to put a Band-Aid over a bullet wound. It's not going to fix the problem.
Yeah. Interesting analogy.
Yeah. So I mean, like our public pressure and our organizing and our direct actions and our political education and our social media presences have pushed the window of the possible far to the left of what any of these bought and paid for legislators and corporate interests and military profiteers would like it to be.
So let me conclude with this. I'm curious to go back to the beginning of our conversation just for a moment. When you talked about the decolonization of Hawaii and the demilitarizing of Hawaii. So again, for all of our mainland and international listeners who say, what? What do you mean? What does that mean? What does that mean?
Essentially what it means is that the military doesn't keep us safe. The U.S. police state doesn't keep us safe. We keep us safe, right? The U.S. military says that they need Red Hill to protect us from foreign threats, from China, from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. But we all know that to be transparently bullshit. And China and Korea have not poisoned our water. They have not threatened our land and water. They have not invaded the sovereign nation of Hawaii. They have not stolen the land of the Kānaka Maoli people, who are the ancestral people of this place, who have for millennia taken care of this land, and pre-colonization made it 100% sustainable, whereas now we are completely dependent on imports. So that is essentially what decolonization and deoccupation would entail, because the US military, they treat everything in the same way that every capitalist project does, as an externality. People are externalities. Labor power, water, land, everything is treated as an externality. And to put a spin on Margaret Thatcher's infamous quote about socialism, eventually you run out of other people's money, which is obviously patently untrue. I would say that under capitalism and under imperialism, eventually you run out of other people's resources. And that's what's happening right now. They've spoiled and contaminated so much land, water, and exploited and genocided so many people. They're getting to a point where the people are rising up and saying, enough, we're not going to let you do this anymore. Get out. Go home, wherever that home is.
So, Mikey, as we conclude, can you tell us where people can connect with this and follow it? Website?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of organizations y'all should follow. Hawaii Peace and Justice, fantastic. You can find them on Twitter and Instagram. Sierra Club of Hawaii, Ka'ohewai, and of course, Oahu Water Protectors. We are Oahu Water Protectors on Instagram and Oahu WP on Twitter. And you can find a lot of updates, news, upcoming actions, and ways that regardless of where you live, you can show up in solidarity in protection of our precious aquifer.
And we'll put those up on our site as well. And again, as I said at the very beginning of our conversation to everybody who's watching and listening, is that this to me is a precedent-setting struggle happening in Hawaii that will affect all of us in the United States and across the globe as well. And it's one that we should pay attention to, one we're going to continue to cover and hear what goes on, and one that they all should take note of and be aware, because it's coming to your doorstep next, if it's not already there. So, Mikey Inouye, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Mahalo. Aloha Kawai.
Thank you all for joining us today. It was good to have you with us, and we're going to stay on top of this story because I think it's a huge and important one. And please let me know what you think about what you heard today and what you'd like us to cover. You can just write to me at mss@therealnews.com, and I'll write you right back. And a reminder that Bill Fletcher Jr. and I will be producing a series here at The Real News called It Can Happen Here. It's about the rise of the right and what we can do to stop it. So for Dwayne Gladden, Stephen Frank, and the crew here at The Real News, I'm Marc Steiner. Stay involved, keep listening, and take care.